webinar series highlighting key findings from our Growing Australia's Oil and Gas Supply Chain report. The report was launched at the Australasian Oil and Gas Conference, AOG, in March earlier this year, but interest has been very strong, so we've decided to host this series to allow people to discover a little more detail in the content, and also to allow for some discussion in a panel format with guests to look more closely at important themes. This is webinar 1, Increasing the Complexity Level of Australia's Energy Supply Chain, exploring the themes of opportunities and challenges. Thanks to everyone for zooming in to what promises to be an interesting, probably fast and informative hour. My name is Roma Sharp and I'm NERA's SME Engagement Manager. I'm also your MC for today and would like to welcome our panellists, Miranda Taylor, CEO of NERA, and Toby Brennan, Managing Director of Alpha Beta in Australia. Yesterday marked the end of National Reconciliation Week 2020 with its theme of In This Together. So with that theme in mind and in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge traditional owners of country across Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. Okay, time for a little housekeeping. So the format for today is, first of all, I'll do a very short theme setting exercise. Miranda will then present the key findings of the report, and then I'll introduce Toby and facilitate a discussion with them both to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities in and emerging from the report. After that, we'll be going to Q&A, and that's where all you people out there come into it. We love to have our audience engaged, so if you have any questions during today's webinar or any comments, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You're welcome to come in anonymously, but if you want to share your name and where you're dialing in from and perhaps your company, that's nice detail for us to have. Given we can't see your faces, it does add to the flavour of it from our perspective. If you see a question that someone else has picked you at the post to ask, or that you also think would be good to have answered, you can upvote it, and again that's at the bottom of the screen too. We will try to get through as many questions as we can during the session and welcome your participation. If you have any technical challenges, again pop it into Q&A and someone from the NERA team will try and sort them out for you. Okay, well we'll get started. So in case there's anyone out there who doesn't know who NERA is, National Energy Resources Australia is one of 6 industry growth centres that were established by the federal government to take a strategic and industry-led approach to driving innovation, productivity and competitiveness in key industry sectors. Like other growth centres, NERA is a not-for-profit organisation and we're led by a board of industry experts. Established in 2016, we work across the breadth and depth of the sector to ensure Australia's energy resources sector is staying ahead of the global automation technology transformation. So, why did we commission a supply chain report and why did we want Alpha Beta to prepare it for us? Well, I don't know about anyone out there, but I was really surprised to find out that this report is the first time anyone has analysed the size and composition of Australia's oil and gas supply chain. I think everyone felt intuitively that there was scope for growth in the value and domestic share of the oil and gas supply chain, but there wasn't a lot of data to back that up. And of course, if you want to grow something, you better know a little bit about it first, the size and the nature. But being an evidence-based organisation, which NERA is, we wanted a rigorous and evidence-based study to get a solid understanding of what we were looking at. But also we wanted to explore and gain a better understanding of the opportunities and challenges that are in there for innovative local businesses. NERA had worked with Alpha Beta previously to produce reports firstly into the oil and gas workforce of the future, and another one with our colleagues at the METS Ignited Growth Centre to look into the value and potential of adopting digital automation across mining and oil and gas. You can find both of those reports plus the supply chain one on the NERA website, nera.org.au. Anyway, so having done that previous work, we knew that we could work with Alpha Beta, and they also have a track record in using advanced data analytics to solve some of the biggest challenges facing business and government. They're known as specialists in deep, insightful analysis to help their clients understand the forces that shape their industries, and have worked with many different types of organisations in a multitude of industry sectors to identify opportunities and develop growth strategies. So really, they were the ideal choice to undertake the study into how we can grow Australia's oil and gas supply chain. NERA was also looking for a mixed methods approach though. We didn't just want to do deep quantitative data. We wanted to bring together anecdotal interviews with real people from the industry to give that data some colour and experience and flavour. Fair to say that our panellists today, Miranda and Toby, were both actively involved in the development of the report we're discussing, and both with their teams brought complementary strengths to that mixed methods approach. Miranda's deep knowledge and connections into the oil and gas industry, and Toby's broad experience in developing supply chain studies for other industries. So on that note, I would like to hand over to Miranda Taylor. Miranda's been the CEO, Chief Executive of NERA since its inception in 2016, and she brings a deep and broad range of energy and resources industry experience, skill and capabilities. Her leadership of NERA is bringing together some of the country's best minds from technology, research and enterprise to achieve NERA's vision of Australia as a global energy powerhouse and a sought-after destination of investment and a leading source of knowledge and solutions. So I'll hand over to Miranda for her presentation today. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Roma. Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this NERA webinar. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and just sort of put a bit of a frame to support what Roma's just said about why we embarked on undertaking this supply of the supply chain in the oil and gas sector. The context, I think, is really interesting. So we embarked on doing this study before COVID-19 struck the world. And I think it's really interesting because many of the things that were already afoot in Australia and globally have really been highlighted by COVID-19. Australia, as everyone knows, has had a long history of being well endowed with a wide range of natural resources, and it's really benefited our economy. It's underpinned our prosperity for decades, and that there is some perception that being a resource economy, that we have not necessarily got the full value of technology and innovation. I think many of us would argue that far from it, that the resources and energy sector have long had a track history of being very innovative and highly technology driven. But it remains true that the Australian economy has needed to diversify, and a range of mega challenges facing the world and also Australia have been impacting on the way we approach our economy. And one of those big transformations is obviously the digital and automation challenge, and the other one is the energy transition. So we have a double-edged component to how Australia and our economy is going to transform into the future, so that Australia indeed has a resilient and diverse economy, and that we're moving up the value chain in terms of where we're focused. Now that was true before COVID-19, and it's indeed why NERA and the other growth centres were created, to try and help over a time horizon build a systems-based ecosystems of innovation and transformation, focusing on areas where Australia has a competitive or indeed a strategic advantage. And it's interesting that that language of competitive and strategic advantage, or some of the modern language has been around sovereign capability, has actually been there for a while, and it's absolutely what Australia's been trying to work to drive for our economy going forward, is that we leverage of the huge advantages that we've had and the huge investment that we've had in key areas like agriculture, mining, energy, oil and gas, defence space, but that we deepen our cross-sector transformation and pull-through of digital technologies. Then COVID-19 happened. So we had commissioned this supply chain. It came out just as COVID-19 occurred. And I think what COVID-19 has really highlighted is that the fundamental premise of what we were all about with the growth centres and with this deepening of looking for value in the Australian economy is absolutely it's actually really underscored the importance of that. And that requires structural change to the economy, and it requires developing a domestic supply chain that is innovative and high value and resilient. And fundamentally, we want those supply chains to be able to really think across sectors and thinking globally from the go-get. And that's not the traditional image of supply chains, of local supply chains. In Australia, there's an image of people being very comfortable and quite comfortable selling into a small market, not necessarily hungry. But where we're going for is we really need supply chains that are looking at where the opportunities are now, and also looking at what the opportunities are across different sectors, and then looking at where the opportunities are globally, because that is the way that we're going to build a resilient economy. So some of the supply chain report that Alpha Beta have produced for us has come up with some really good insights into our supply chain. I think they're really have been seized on by a range of players in the post-COVID, as we come out of the post-COVID world, and we look at how we're going to recover our economy. The supply chain looks at the composition and looks at the ability to achieve a $7 billion potential value add from building a stronger, innovative supply chain. And that is obviously really important in the COVID-19 experience. So look, compared to our global peers, the Australian oil and gas suppliers are relatively young, and they capture a smaller share of both the domestic and export markets through the cycle. The local supply chain, though, is a vital contributor, and it's approximately 1.2 times the size of the building construction sector, and it generates almost 2% of the nation's GDP. So the domestic chain contributes 38 billion to the economy. So as you can see, it really is an important sector. However, there are some key challenges that are constraining the Australia's oil and gas supply chain. All of the research, all of the studies that we did with Alpha Beta show that we're operating at the low complexity, highly localized end of the spectrum of work, for which growth opportunities are limited. So we're good at doing low complexity work that can be performed at a local level, but unfortunately that means that the opportunity to export and to really go up the value chain are limited. There is also a perception, and there has been a perception and perhaps a reality, that Australia has been a very high cost region, and that makes the attraction for investment into Australia challenging and hard for operators to invest in local supply chain companies. And it's also true that for decades, the oil and gas sector has had a very mature, global and complex supply chain. And in that world, it was very hard for local suppliers to compete. And I would also add to that if we go back 5 years, the Australian oil and gas industry was really in a large construction commissioning phase of its life. And although we had some mature assets around the country in places like the Bass Strait and the Northern Territory, we were really in a massive construction and commissioning phase. So the opportunities for really innovative suppliers in the ops and maintenance were relatively limited. But today, the world that we live in today, it's very much an ops and maintenance, it's an operations and maintenance opportunity. Suppliers really do need to deepen the areas of strength if they're going to be able to operate in this operations and maintenance world. And I think there's a couple of things here. as we come out of COVID-19, operators in the oil and gas sector are looking at what the long-term opportunities for their growth are. What is the long-term future for gas, for oil and gas, and indeed where and at what point will the sector start to grow in other new energies and other opportunities that are available. And therefore, there's two sort of angles that supply chains need to deepen their focus on. It's the sort of high value digital automation, really focusing on low cost, reducing costs and improving productivity in the operations and maintenance phase of all the LNG and other oil and gas assets that we operate in Australia. And then it's also having line of sight to where there's overlaps with other industry sectors. So in renewables, in offshore opportunities, where could we look to partner for opportunities going forward, not just so we can have a short-term horizon around ops and maintenance, but also a long-term vision about where we might go into new energy and what the technologies are that might be able to be adapted across that time horizon. So the oil and gas supply chain on a global level is mature and complex, and it is operating in the high technology end of the spectrum. But in Australia, as I've already indicated, the advantage is that we're really focused in the low complex, lower values. And this chart that I've just put up on the slide now for you all to see is really, I think, probably one of the most interesting visuals that came out of the study, is really to see where we're operating now and where the opportunities for Australia to move up the value chain are as we move into more automation and monitoring, more small scale specialized manufacturing, pipeline design, some massive opportunities for the supply chain to work in this, and then to look at, well, where might there be overlaps with other industry sectors in doing it. At the moment, we tend to be down in the transport, logistics, drilling, well services. All of that's really good, but if we're really going to go global, we need to move more up the automation, digital, and more high value specialized end of the spectrum. So I think that's really sort of just another visual of how we want to move our capabilities up to the right-hand end of the quadrant. It's going to be imperative, if we're going to go on this journey, that the operators, but also importantly, the large supply chains, the large global supply companies that are here in Australia, they're often the ones that are actually doing the work. They're also the ones with the highest driver for finding the productivity, the efficiency. They've got to compete for work on cost, but they want to make sure that they're providing quality. So it's got to be high quality, but as low cost as possible. So how can we partner with the large supply chain companies that are global, with governments and with our innovation organizations, including universities or research organizations, to support local companies and help those local companies go global by providing solutions, by partnering with large global supply chain companies. They have basically a lovely pathway to go into global markets. So areas that we've identified in the report, we've looked at where we could work across different sectors, and I think, just to pick one out of here, and we can share these slides with everybody after. Everybody will have heard about the focus of remote operations and robotics, and the fact that Australia and the mining and oil and gas sector have formed a unique partnership with the space industry and with defence as well, to look at how we can use robotics and how can we fast track learnings from being able to work in the International Space Stations and with communication satellites and things, to be able to support remote operations. And obviously for a country like Australia that's geographically challenged, the ability to work in full automation in remote operations and to do it safely is a huge benefit. And you can envisage a world where we're running operations from Perth for countries, other countries. So a huge opportunity to piggyback off that, to look at the ability to use artificial intelligence, data analytics, satellite imagery, and ultimately to go to full interoperability. So some very, very great examples of cross-industry sector transfer. And indeed, healthcare is another one where the healthcare industry is using digital technology and robotics to carry out medical support for remote operations for our industry. And this is the remote operations example that I gave you, arose, which was an announcement with the WA government, the Space Agency, and a number of other parties around Australian remote operations for space and Earth, and all of these opportunities that come out of it that have huge benefits for local innovative supply chains to move into AV, robotics, smart sensors, 3D printing, and all of those opportunities. However, there's also a huge imperative that SMEs, the small innovative companies, really need to work to understand better the buyer's priorities, to really understand their business capabilities. Very often small businesses tend to be focused on their technology offering and not really understand the world that they're going to be operating in, and what some of the barriers and issues that their buyers might be facing. On the flip side, the buyers need to address some of their procurement barriers, and I think this is fundamental. If we're going to support productivity, innovation, resilience and growth in Australia, we really need to set up alternative procurement pathways and a different culture. So at the moment, many organisations would be reasonably siloed with their resources, and the procurement pathway tends to be very contract driven, and very often focused on price, as opposed to a partnership around problem solving, to really drive innovation, and to really find a way to form partnerships with innovators, so that each side of the equation can get to know each other, that they can start to develop trust and relationships, and therefore form an innovation partnership. So this is a very interesting slide, in that the Alpha Beta did a survey of what the different perceptions of the different sides of the equation, suppliers versus buyers, assessment of what was relevant when they came to the equation, when they came to the relationship. Now this is about perception. It's not necessarily about what's fact on either side, but what it shows is that there are definite misalignments between what the buyers and the suppliers' perception of what is relevant are. So for instance, the suppliers put cost competitiveness as a relevant of 22%, and the buyer's assessment of relevance of cost competitiveness was only 8%. The supplier's perception of low cost was 0%, and the buyer's assessment was 17%. So as you can see, there's some real different alignments around, and that goes to the heart of the fact that the two groups of parties are not highly aligned, and they're not working closely together. So what now? So NERA is very much focused on how are we going to manage the journey to the future for Australia, and obviously COVID-19 has highlighted this. We want to optimize today, so obviously all of the oil and gas assets, particularly in this highly challenged oil price environment, are going to have to search for every single cost, productivity, efficiency gain that they can get, and the temptation would be to not invest in innovation, whereas in fact innovation and supply chain innovation actually can be fundamental to driving asset performance, and to lead the productivity and growth of the sector. But we've also got to adapt for tomorrow. So we've got to start scaling and looking for how we're going to move to full automation and interoperability, how we're going to change our partnerships for innovation, and most importantly, how are we going to manage the low carbon and the new energy future. So how do we transform for the future, and who are the parties that we're going to partner, who are we going to partner with to go on this journey? We've got a range of collaborative projects that we've worked on with supply chain companies. So we've got a range of supply chain projects and initiatives that we're driving to try and be the trusted connector between the large supply chain companies and the operators, and where we're seeing amazing innovation on the ground in Australia, and how can we bring them together in an environment that makes it safe for them to partner. And there are lots of legitimate reasons why it's difficult for big companies to adopt technology. And so what are those barriers to them adopting technology, and how can we help overcome them, which is what our programs. So we really do need to achieve faster adoption of new technologies, but that's going to require organizational culture and strategies that support collective experimentation. It's also going to take continuous learning and an ability to change, adapt, and it's going to take a multi-pronged approach across the key sectors. And fundamentally, it's going to be hard work. We're not going to get here except by everybody working collaboratively together. And we need to expand the area that we see as collaborative and reduce the area that we see as competitive. There will always be a need for competition. It's fundamental to our economic model. But the area that we compete in should be at the very, very high value end, and the area that we collaborate and work together in to basically create a vibrant, diverse economy for Australia is going to take us all working together. So that is the end of my formal presentation, and I'm sorry there was a few glitches in sharing it with you. There was I've had to change computer. I actually poured oat milk all over my keyboard yesterday, so I do apologise. I've got a sticky keyboard, but thank you very much. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a very good conversation with Toby going now, where we can actually really explore in a little bit more depth what we see as some of from Toby's great experience, and with Roma facilitating it, is what some of the opportunities are going for us to really build a strong economy across Australia based on the oil and gas industry's investment. So Roma, do you want to facilitate?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Miranda. I love that presentation. There's just so many interesting points in it and opportunities. I'd like to just give a little brief introduction for Toby Brennan, who leads Alpha Beta's Australian operations. He's based in Sydney. Are you actually in Sydney today for this?
I am. I'm in Sydney. Yeah.
Excellent. Hard to tell from here. So Toby's an experienced strategy consultant, and he works across both the public and private sectors to help our clients understand new and emerging industries in cybersecurity, artificial intelligence and sustainability, and their implications for skills needs for Australia. I think he probably has a 15-minute CV there, but I think we'll just leave it at that, Toby, and say that you were very much involved in developing the report. Did you want to add anything to what I said earlier about the development of the report?
Sure. Well, Roma, thank you for the introduction and the kind words, and thanks to Miranda and Roma and NERA for the opportunity to work on this. When I first worked on oil and gas supply chains probably 15 years ago when I was at McKinsey, right at the beginning of my consulting career. So it's been really interesting to come back to the sector post-investment boom and observe how the sector's developed and evolved through that boom. As Roma said, we do a lot of work in supply chains at Alpha Beta. We've developed some really interesting techniques using big data to understand supply chains. We've applied those techniques across defence industry, cybersecurity, across METS, with work with METS Ignited. So it was great to have the opportunity to apply some of those techniques to oil and gas and to observe how much has changed in oil and gas over the last 15 years.
just on this report, Toby, were there any surprises? Did anything jump out at you from either compared with last time or compared with other sectors?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I might just mention two things that I think were surprising and pleasantly surprising as well.
That's good.
I think the first thing is just the size of the domestic contribution to the oil and gas. Started talking to people in the industry. I think there's a perception that the boom has been entirely driven by imports, you know, large LNG plant equipment, and that the domestic supply chain hasn't really capitalised on the opportunity that the investment boom has created. But what the data shows is that the domestic contribution to the supply chain is really very significant. Across the whole of the supply chain segments, you know, it's around 70% of the value added is domestic, which is a terrific result. And even when you narrow that focus down to what we call the specialised supply chain, so that's the supply to the oil and gas operators of products or services that are specialised for use in oil and gas rather than generic products and services. Even there, it's still around 60% of the value add is domestic. So I think, you know, the first thing we should do is pat ourselves on the back a little bit and recognise that actually there's been tremendous growth and development in the domestic supply chain through the boom. And I think the second thing that surprised us was that despite some of the challenges that the supply chain faces going forward, there are some really positive and promising examples of Australian firms manufacturing domestically. And in some ways, the changes in manufacturing that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years through Industry 4.0 and the adoption of new manufacturing technologies that are more scalable at smaller and larger scales has enabled some Australian companies to manufacture really efficiently in Australia. You know, Nexus, who you mentioned before, but a number of other firms that we spoke to, you know, who are able to do low-cost manufacturing in Australia with the right equipment. And that probably wasn't possible, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that's one of the really interesting green shoots as well, is that technical manufacturing capacity, which is beginning to build up again.
Miranda, did you want to comment on that manufacturing side? I know you have thoughts on this area.
Yeah, well, look, I think, I guess the huge opportunity going forward, because obviously the whole debate about manufacturing is quite big in this country at the moment. And, you know, I think sometimes what gets missed from the equation is that I think the general theme of the debate at the moment is that cheap gas is going to drive some sort of manufacturing bonanza in Australia, as opposed to it's actually technology driving, it's manufacturing technology that is going to drive and underpin the economy. And whether that is in the oil and gas sector or the mining sector or the agricultural sector, it's actually going to be investment in technology or innovation that can drive efficiency and productivity is going to be the actual thing that drives the economy, not cheap gas. And if we do get cheaper gas, it will be through innovation and things. I think there's that angle. But Toby, I think there are all sorts of reasons why it's hard for big companies to adopt innovative technology or, you know, new energy technology. Have you got any insights from working with other sectors that have big companies about how they overcome, you know, how they change their procurement model, how they change the culture to actually, because there are legitimate barriers. I mean, if you've got big capital assets with old production lines, it's not easy to go in and change things. And often there's competing agendas within a company for what the immediate priority for their business is. And that's all very legitimate. So some insights from other sectors about how they go about addressing some of those things?
Yeah, really good question. Age-old problem of how do large companies engage with the SME sector, procure innovation. I work a lot, the other sector I work in a lot is the cybersecurity industry. And we have very similar dynamics around innovation there, where we have a lot of great innovative Australian SMEs and startups with really interesting products in that security space, and a lot of very skeptical large customers who are unwilling to engage with that SME space who see that as a high risk proposition. And I think, the first thing is just to acknowledge that a lot of those concerns that large organisations have are completely legitimate as well. They're dealing with high risk procurement decisions. The cost of procuring from a larger number of organisations is almost always higher as well. And they've got critical assets that they need to service and maintain. And so I think, there are really legitimate concerns. And I think there's room for action on both sides of that equation as well, Miranda. I think there's definitely the need to create better procurement pathways within those large organisations. I think partnering is a key one there. Like the most successful examples that we've observed across all kinds of sectors where there's some kind of risk-sharing partnership between an SME and a large organisation. And there's a deep buy-in by both of them to make the product work and to make the product scale. And there's not this kind of, I think it's the misallocation of risk in those relationships that makes it hardest to get it off the ground. So that's probably the best model that I've observed in cybersecurity. And I think there are some really good examples of it in oil and gas as well, right? Where we stop viewing as a purchasing relationship and we start viewing as a co-investment and partnership, and that we agree we're going to co-develop this, and that some of the long-term upside of that as well is available to the larger organisation. But I do think, that there's a real challenge for SMEs who have these technologies as well to make them as relevant and as applicable to the needs of their customers as possible. And again, this is a challenge that we observe a lot across different sectors. You can never be too close to your customer. And I think it's particularly a problem where you have a massive scale imbalance between suppliers and procurers, which you do in some parts of oil and gas, where you just have very different organisational mentalities and structures. And it's hard for SMEs to really envisage, as we saw in the survey data that you presented, Miranda, it's just really hard for SMEs to envisage what goes on inside large organisations and how they manage their risks and how they make decisions. So while there's definitely some room for improvement from the procurers themselves, I do think you can never be too close to your customers. Is the key message for me for SMEs.
Yeah, I think that's true. Just a quick question for me, and then see if Rome wants it. In this post-COVID-19 world, do you think that the perception of Australia as being a high-cost destination might finally be challenged? That we might be able to position ourselves, because that will make a big difference if we're not seen to be a $10 a coffee country. That we're actually seen as a little bit more. So are you seeing any signs of that?
That's a really good question. I think that's going to be hard to change. But I also don't necessarily think that we have to change that, right? I mean, well, we do. We've got to change it from being a high cost we've got to change the perception from being high cost to high value, right? Like fundamentally, we do need to do that. But, if you look at, my view of how you have to build a successful business here in this country is you have to accept the reality of the structure of this economy, right? It's a high wage economy, it's a high skill economy. And if you want to build your business for resilience and for export markets, you have to accept that reality and look for opportunities to build off that skill base. And if you look at, there are areas of the economy where we've done that poorly. If you look at how we approach manufacturing through the 70s and 80s and 90s, we did that really poorly. But then there are other areas of the economy where we've done that really well. So if you look at medtech, you'd say Australia has recognised that it's expensive, but it's got great skills, and it's built an industry which is really high value and really highly regarded and innovation driven. So, and I think the oil and gas supply chain has that choice of positioning itself as being high value, not trying to be low cost. And I think that's the right strategy for the future. To be honest, COVID or no COVID, I think those structural conditions of the Australian economy are not going to change.
Yeah. And do you think, given the work you did on automation for us with Nets Ignited, do you think that the development of the digital world is actually possibly making it easier to do local innovation, because it's created an environment where you can use things like digital twins and simulations, and the whole driver for not doing something and just to go to long relationships with mature supply chains that you've that it's all locked in, proprietary, and you know what you're getting, and it's safe. Do you think technology is sort of potentially going to enable and support Australia it could actually work as an advantage for us?
Yeah, I do. I really do, actually. And I think we see that across a lot of sectors, that it's getting easier to do innovation in Australia, even if you're not at the centre of the global market. But I think there's kind of two interesting forces that are pulling against each other a bit on that, Miranda, where I think it's a lot easier to do innovation in Australia, but I don't see technology as changing the way you have to go to market. One of the really interesting things that we heard talking to suppliers in oil and gas was that some of them had just gone straight to Houston. They'd just gone straight to the energy corridor and skipped their go-to-market in Australia because they found it too difficult, and they needed to go to the global centre of power for where decisions were made in that supply chain. It's very similar to what we see again in cybersecurity. Lots of Australian firms just go, you know what, I'm just going to go straight to Silicon Valley. That's where the financing is, and that's where the big customers go to look for products. But they still do the innovation here, right? So they'll often have innovation teams doing a lot of the development based in Australia, but they'll have go-to-market and sales offices based in the global hubs for those types of decisions. So you see a localization and a globalization going on in different parts of the organization between innovation and go-to-market. And I think that approach works quite well. I think a lot of firms have been quite successful in that in separating those two components.
Yeah, well, as long as they then bring some of the opportunity back here. So
as long as the money comes back here,
finance doesn't really matter as long as the jobs and the opportunities come back here as well.
Exactly.
We're definitely seeing quite a bit of that, Toby. I wanted to now just go to a couple of questions from our Zoomers. We've got one here from Boris Novak. Thanks for your question, Boris. The opportunity around big data, data analytics, machine learning and AI is pan-industry. How open are systems in the oil and gas supply chain to be able to access data for these types of innovations? Coming from the defence industry where data protocols do have standards, there are opportunities to get into these. Is this the case with oil and gas, or do proprietary systems dominate?
So I can start answering that. And then Toby, I'm sure you have some insights. Look, this is obviously a big issue. The whole issue of how we're going to move to interoperability to get the true benefits of automation and Industry 4.0. There's a huge amount of work that's gone on in the United States, led by, I think, ExxonMobil set up the Open Process Forum. And then there's a number of other initiatives that are working on the data standards and protocols and some use cases around oil and gas assets, and actually looking at broader assets as well, looking at the fact that in critical industries, we're actually interdependent. If you're looking at energy, water, others, so critical infrastructure, critical assets in a digital world are all now codependent on each other, and yet at the moment they're all using proprietary technology and proprietary data, which makes it very, very difficult. So there's a bunch of work going on. NERA is working with Mimosa and the Asset Institute in Australia on an initiative around some SMEs and some use cases for Australia around oil and gas assets, and looking at the standards and the data protocols to enable us to move to more open systems. We're also partnered with Mets Ignited and a number of other organisations, including UWA, on the ERDI test lab, Industry 4.0 test lab, which is based in the headquarters in Perth, which is providing a test lab for small technology developers to come and work using some software to enable their data to read across multiple technologies. So I don't think we're there yet. I think we're doing, some of the companies are investing a lot in data skills and data, but I think we've still got a long way to go in Australia, but there's some really good things beginning to happen. It's just very early.
Thank you, Miranda. Did you have anything to add, Toby?
Look, I think Miranda said everything. She knows the dynamics of this in oil and gas much better than I do. I mean, my only observation will be that, I think most industries struggle with this. I think defence is a little unusual because it has, nationally a single procurer, and governments have insisted on driving data standards better. But in most other industries that we work in, this is an ongoing challenge with lack of protocols and standards around data.
Okay, well, we might move on to another one. Thanks for that question, Ivan. Sorry, Boris. Close. I've now got a question from Robert Akers from Anstow. He has asked, is the move up the value chain possible with existing assets? What infrastructure is needed to enable the transformation?
Again, I can start with it and hand to Toby say. Look, I think it is really difficult to integrate technologies into existing assets. You've got legacy assets. I know, but what I think is enabling it is the use of living laboratories and test labs. And if indeed the future LNG, micro LNG facility does the CRC, that will provide in effect a safe environment to test out technologies and to work out how they could be safely deployed and integrated into existing assets. I think it is a difficult one, and again, it comes back down to how do you incentivize, and it would take careful thinking around how you would manage it. But Toby, you probably, from working with other industries, have got a bit more insight.
Yeah, look, it's as you'd be aware as well, Miranda, this is a really similar concern in METs as well, that it's very difficult to innovate outside of the construction phase or outside of the development phase of projects. My sense is that as the innovation pressures change and there's more cost and sensitivity through the operations and maintenance phase, it creates opportunities there. But it's true to some extent that those opportunities are more at the margin than at the heart of the innovation in the project. But you've got to remember that a lot of these assets will need to be renewed over the next 10 or 15 years anyway. That there's incremental capex that's going on across all these assets, particularly in unconventional. So I do think there are still opportunities, but it is fair to say that it does make it more challenging. It's more challenging to do in an operating phase or a post-boom phase, I think.
Okay, well, thank you, Toby. We've got one here from Tony Williams, who has a NERA grant, a project grant, and then I'm going to push in and ask my own question. Tony has asked, he's been given a NERA grant to develop a CSG industry-specific wellhead compressor that is not available worldwide to increase gas production by potentially 30%. But he's concerned with engineering IP being stolen by overseas suppliers as they move from R&D to commercialisation. He's asking Toby if you have any advice.
I don't want to pass myself off as an IP lawyer or an expert on how to protect yourself in global trade. It's a really interesting question, Tony. It's actually not something that we heard during our interviews previously, but I think it's a really live issue. It's an issue certainly that I hear in other sectors around the risks of globalizing the supply chain and exposing yourself. But I'm also not sure that keeping local or a local go-to-market strategy really protects you anyway from that type of IP infringement. The kind of globalization of marketplaces generally makes IP vulnerable. I think you've just got to do everything you can to protect it, both legally and practically and commercially. But no, it's an interesting point. I don't have an off-the-shelf solution for that one though.
I suspect that large companies find that all the time. I mean, the large supply chain companies like Komatsu and Sandvik and all of them probably constantly struggle to protect their IP in a global market. I know one innovative manufacturing company that I talked to quite a number of years ago actually, and they were one of the ones that was not whinging about how the manufacturing sector hadn't been supported in Australia, because their view was that they went to China, they had a look at what China was doing, they worked out what they couldn't do and what they couldn't do to compete, and they came back and they found an area that they could be really successful in competing in, and they drove it, and they were a really successful manufacturing company. But one thing they said to me is that they never even tried to really own IP. because they were just constantly adapting and moving. Now that's probably not entirely relevant for Tony's example, but they said that they didn't, basically by the time the people got access to their IP, developed it, they'd already moved on and were already ahead of the game in the innovation stage.
Well, I was going to push in, but I'm going to allow Abraham Rojas Zuniga from UWA, allow his question in. Thanks for the webinar. You've mentioned about remote operations and provided some examples of that. But in the case of predictive maintenance, could you mention some areas or particular factors which may be critical to solve in the oil and gas sector?
I'm not quite sure what exact examples we're looking for, maybe Toby, but I mean, maintenance and predictive maintenance is obviously a critical thing. If you don't have to, you think of the amount of money that's spent on, you know, big shutdowns and maintenance activities. It's a potentially enormous area.
I mean, the area where we see a lot of really interesting use of machine learning models, it's actually around things like corrosion. You know, like really getting into the detail in offshore. We've been working recently on a client who we've developed, well, partners of ours are developing a whole bunch of really complex interactive machine learning models that interact with each other in order to understand the impact of corrosion in offshore. And that's obviously, you know, a huge area. I think the other area is around onshore wells as well, in unconventional, and understanding the maintenance and you know, the opportunity with machine learning to reduce cost is enormous. We're seeing just kind of staggering cost savings, particularly in hard to reach assets, by having a better understanding of, you know, the real detail of equipment failures such as corrosion.
Yeah. I mean, the big opportunity I think probably is from prescriptive maintenance, isn't it, ultimately? Not just waiting for the predictive thing, but you're actually prescribing the standards by which your equipment performs to, so that you actually, you know, that's the huge opportunity. And you're absolutely right that corrosion in all its forms is a big issue for the sector, but we're working in very harsh environments in many cases, so it's a big area. I
wanted to jump in if I could, Miranda and Toby. Miranda, you talked in your presentation about, you know, transitioning to renewables and new energies. I was just wondering, how do you go about activating a supply chain? You know, how do you create one, Toby, or how do you get one activated rather than tapping into one that already exists? Miranda, you probably have comments too.
You mean in some of the in some of the renewables areas?
Yeah.
Yes, really, really good question, Roma. It's a question we're answering at the moment. I'm doing work on offshore wind, which is a really interesting new sector that does not exist in Australia. Very large in Europe, and huge drivers of demand for offshore wind in Asia, particularly in North Asia over the next 10 or 15 years. And it leverages a lot of capability from oil and gas as well, right? In offshore operations, in monopiles and subsea structures. So that's what's really, I think, particularly exciting about it for Australia, is the ability to transfer some of that capability we've built in oil and gas into other forms of offshore energy. How do you activate the supply chain? Well, we're doing really detailed work on that. So we're literally mapping at the firm level, firms in different regions relative to the project we're working on that we think could have relevant capability. Like, we're literally going through a CapEx and OpEx schedule and matching it with firms and identifying potential skill sets. So we're doing skills mapping as well, and capability mapping. So there's a real boots on the ground starting point for me, where you've really got to get into the nuts and bolts of what you need, and think about where practically you can source those capabilities. But then the key to activating that supply chain is being able to give those firms comfort that there's a demand pipeline. And that's the real challenge, I think, with some of these new renewables, particularly when you've got an early mover project like that, is that firms understandably are skeptical about reorienting their capability for one project if they don't know that there's going to be project 2, project 3, project 4 on the horizon. I think government does have a role there in providing comfort to the supply chain as well, that this is an industry development priority for government, and that the supply chain and the project pipeline will continue to be supported after that, after it's activated through that first project.
I think the LNG industry is a classic case of that, of, you know, how did the LNG industry in Australia really get off the ground in partnership with governments? And, you know, I think renewables, it's interesting. Do you think a similar study is being done of the hydrogen supply chain?
I don't think it has yet, no.
No, I don't think
no, I haven't seen it anyway, not on the supply chain, no.
No, I think that's the next study.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the wind one, I think, you know, the area there really interesting, isn't it? Is in the light of the bushfires, is the whole resilience of the coastal communities around Australia and the integration with microgrids, etc. Really interesting opportunity.
And the links between offshore wind and hydrogen, of course, as well, right? The opportunity to create
offshore wind and hydrogen, which is emerging in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, look, we're getting close to wrapping up. Were there any final comments about opportunities or challenges before we wrap up?
No, I would just like to say that I think there's a huge opportunity, and there's an enormous amount of real innovation and original thinking in Australia, and I totally get Toby's point about that the going to the market we need to have an intelligent approach about it. But I think I think we should be excited, even we don't want to be complacent, because, you know, the economy is in for a really rough time, but I think we should conclude by saying that there is enormous opportunity for a supply chain that is able to supply into the oil and gas sector, and potentially to focus on the big supply chain companies, not just always think about the operators, but to actually think about the supply chain companies who are global supply chain companies. That it's very important to form global partnerships. Don't just think Australia, think global, think cross industry sector, because that's the only way we're going to get scale in industry in Australia, is by thinking cross sector and thinking global, and that way we can get the scale that we need. But so I think don't be complacent. We do need to move beyond just thinking that we can supply one industry or one company. I think that's the fundamental message, and for the industry itself to survive into the future, that we're going to have to find different ways of procuring innovation or building in innovation and partnerships to get those real productivity and efficiencies. We can't do it. There's this sort of mentality that we can just do it ourselves internally, and we can't. The best brains do not sit inside the operators. They're out in the ecosystem, and if you really want to have a really vibrant future, you need to access the best wherever it is, and it's probably not it's not necessarily in your company, but I think there's enormous opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to working with companies in Australia to really deepen the value that we can create.
Thank you, Miranda. Well, look, we're pretty much on closing time, so I will wrap it up there. And thank you for the presentation, Miranda. It was brilliant, as usual. And look, thanks very much, Toby, too, for giving up your time and sharing your insights and wisdom and learnings from other sectors. It's been really, really useful. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Toby.
And thanks to everyone for participating. Thanks for the people that put questions in. They were really great. Some really good ones there. I just wanted to let you all know that we are doing another one of these next week at the same time. The second one is looking at the importance of innovation when working in high-cost environments. And we'll be hearing from some technology SMEs to get their side of the story, which will be well worth attending. So same time, same place, as it were, next week.